Like the German invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks in 2001, Russia's invasion of Ukraine last month was a tectonic event that abruptly transformed the world. The military campaign has resulted in destruction of cities, commission of war crimes, and has forced millions of refugees to flee to neighboring states. The West has responded with crippling sanctions, and Russia has answered with implied threats to use nuclear and chemical weapons. I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today on Talking Foreign Policy, I've assembled a panel of leading experts, including a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, a UN peace negotiator, the head of a national security think tank, and an international law expert, to help make sense of the Ukraine crisis and explore what is likely to come next, right after the news. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast, our expert panelists will be taking you on a deep dive into the Ukraine crisis. We will discuss how we got to this point, options for holding Russian leaders accountable for war crimes, and what comes next, including potential pathways to peace. For the program today, I've assembled a panel of experts on military issues, national security, war crimes prosecutions, and peace negotiations. With me in the IDEA studio in Cleveland is Professor Milena Stereo, a chaired international law professor at Cleveland Marshall College of Law, who joined me just last month in making an amicus argument before the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It's so good to have you back on the program, Milena.
It is such a pleasure to be here, Michael.
I'm also pleased to introduce Associate Dean Avidan Cover, the director of a think tank located at Case Western Reserve University School of Law called the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy. Before joining the Faculty of Law at Case Western, Avi served as counsel to Human Rights First, a leading human rights organization. Welcome to the show, Avi.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor to be here.
And joining us from Washington, D.C. is retired Navy Captain Sandy Hodgkinson, who has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Deputy to the Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues. Thanks for joining us, Sandy.
Thank you, Michael, for having me here today on this panel to discuss this national security crisis unfolding in Europe. I appreciate it.
And finally, joining us from the nation's capital is Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize-nominated NGO. Paul has served as legal counsel in a dozen peace negotiations over the past 25 years, and he just published a new book titled Lawyering Peace. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be back.
So let's start with a little background. For 80 years, Ukraine was one of the 15 republics of the Soviet state. Then in 1991, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became an independent country. Let me start the conversation with Paul Williams. Other than separate governments and political borders since 1991, is Ukraine just another territory of Russia, or are there real differences with respect to the people, the language, and history of the two?
Well, Michael, I'm really glad you asked me that question because this is one of the narratives that's getting put out there, which is, well, Ukraine, Russia, all part of the same language, culture, history, all part of the same country. That's not the reality. Ukraine has a very distinct culture, a very distinct language. Quite frankly, it has a very distinct political system. It's democratic, unlike what you see in Russia. And it was a part of the USSR, along with 14 other republics, but it was never part of Russia. And in fact, during the Cold War, Ukraine had its own seat in the United Nations. So throughout the entire time, from the beginning of the United Nations through to today, Ukraine has been an independent member of the UN, clearly a distinct identity.
And then in 1994, the Ukraine agreed to give up its substantial arsenal of Soviet nuclear weapons in return for security assurances. The Budapest Memorandum was signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Milena Stereo, can you tell us about this international instrument? Was it binding? What did it promise?
Sure, Michael. So as you mentioned, in 1994, because Ukraine essentially on its territory had these nuclear weapons that were part of the Soviet arsenal of nuclear weapons, it was really important for the Western countries to make sure that these weapons were accounted for and did not all of a sudden belong to a new country. This is part of the nuclear non-proliferation. So the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia, as well as Ukraine, signed this memorandum in 1994, whereby Ukraine agreed to give up its arsenal of nuclear weapons in exchange for these three countries promising not to use the weapons against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. This memorandum does not, unfortunately, have the status of an international treaty, and it does not really have an enforcement mechanism. In other words, there's not a way to directly enforce it. And so although in theory it binds these nations, there's no way to enforce it. And another point that's really important to mention here is that the U.S. and the U.K., pursuant to this memo, provide assurances to Ukraine but not guarantees, which means that they don't have a legal obligation to militarily intervene in Ukraine if it is attacked by another country.
Oh, you say tomato, I say tomato. All right, one last piece of this puzzle. Right after its disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russia was reportedly promised that there would be no expansion of NATO eastward. Yet, since 1997, NATO has expanded into 14 countries between Western Europe and Russia's doorstep. Sandy Hodgkinson, how did this set the stage for the Russian invasion in Ukraine?
Russia is arguing today that the expansion of NATO membership to many parts of the former Soviet Union, including prospective potential relationships with Ukraine, poses a threat to Russian sovereignty. This is not consistent with the historical development of NATO enlargement, and NATO provides no threat to Russian sovereignty. As a little historical background, since the beginning of 1991 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, Mikhail Gorbachev has repeatedly stated that NATO enlargement was never discussed at the time and there was no agreement on it. So any statement that there was is not true. He's argued that there was a spirit of statements and assurances at the time that Russia could believe would be inconsistent with NATO enlargement, but there was no statement to that effect. After 1991, many of the former Warsaw Pact countries, including the Baltic state, wanted greater assurances of their security, particularly with tensions rising during the Chechen War, within Moscow, former Soviet Asian countries, and even in the Eastern Bloc country wars. Ultimately, in the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, NATO and Russia agreed that they did not consider each other as adversaries and that NATO transformation was a process that will continue, which clearly shows no objection from Russia. While relationships with the former Eastern Bloc countries and the U.S. and NATO were always open and transparent, there still has always been this somewhat, silent concern by Russia over NATO expansion into the area of Ukraine and Belarus. And I think that's the issue we're facing right now. There is no direct threat to Russian sovereignty. However, we could expand further and further east until we got close to Ukraine and Belarus, and I think that's where they're drawing the line.
Well, and then tensions came to a head in 2014 after Ukrainians ousted a Russian-aligned president, Viktor Yanukovych. Russia, claiming to be protecting ethnic Russians and Russian speakers from Ukrainian persecution, then annexed the Crimea region of Ukraine. Avi Cover, how did the West respond to that?
Well, you have to keep in mind, this was the first annexation of territory in Europe since World War II, since the Nazis had annexed so much. And this flagrant violation of international law, a violation of the Budapest memo that Milena mentions, was a significant violation of international law. The primary response, and one we're of course hearing so much about at an even higher degree today, were sanctions. But they weren't the sanctions that we're seeing presently in the current conflict. They were more discreet while widespread. They were in concert between the United States and the EU. But by and large, they didn't target the entire Russian economic system as we see right now and covering all sorts of sectors. They were targeted at specific individuals, at companies. And certainly they had some effect, and even initially significant effect. And perhaps we'll get into this later, the impact of sanctions, the efficacy of sanctions is a highly debated issue. And I think at least what's clear is that the Russian economy rebounded quite a bit, particularly as oil prices rose and really through a variety of other factors in society. So they weren't imposed by any means at the level we're seeing today. And I think we're seeing some results of that. The other thing that I think merits mention is that the Obama administration didn't, for example, provide lethal weapons to Ukraine that they had asked for. And so there certainly wasn't the same kind of military assistance. And we've seen, as of late, various members of the administration expressing some regret that they hadn't acted more aggressively toward Putin in both trying to deter and even punish him.
So let me ask you a follow-up, Avi. Geopolitically, what is at stake if Russia takes over all of the Ukraine?
Well, I think, if we were to see that, it would call into question really our entire international rules-based system that came about and has largely worked since 1945. It would undermine, I think, in many respects, the cardinal Article 2.4 rule in the UN Charter that all member states will refrain from threatening or using force against the territorial integrity of another state. And this would be a clear violation. I think the larger ramifications, as we see, as you said, geopolitically, would this embolden China to act in such a manner toward Taiwan? Would we see other countries act in similar fashion, seeing that they can get away with it, really? Another question that is raised, of course, that Russia has raised the specter of using nuclear weapons. Does this incentivize states to have such weapons? And that sort of blunts the effect of military intervention.
So let's talk about what's going on the ground. Sandy, you served for 2 decades as an officer in the U.S. military. From that perspective, can you tell us about Russia's strategy and tactics for invading and trying to take over the Ukraine?
Well, from a military standpoint, Russia very deliberately placed forces on the border of Ukraine, using their annexed territory of Crimea, using Belarus as a puppet. But putting troops in Belarus, they did it under a ruse, that it was just a military training activity, and repeatedly stated that they would withdraw them. Deception is a standard practice in military, and this is something that they were carefully doing here. Their assumption was that they would be uncontested as they moved forward, and they were obviously looking to see how the response would go. The military immediately launched an offense to take the largest city in the west, Kharkiv, where they then argued that the rebel forces were present, making, again, an argument that there was another reason to invade other than pure aggression. When they met significant resistance, they continued to move in through the country towards Kiev to take the capital. They've also added to that a successful military aerial campaign with bombing of all different types we'll talk about in a little while. So these are very standard military practices. Ruse is often used, deception is often used. I think it's sort of the edge of brinksmanship here to see if there would be a response at any point before they entered the territory of the Ukraine.
All right, well, it's time for us to take a short break. When we return, we'll focus our discussion on accountability for the brutal war crimes in Ukraine that we're seeing in the news. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and 89.7 WKSU. I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've seen horrible images of Russian bombing and shelling of schools, hospitals, kindergartens, an orphanage, residential buildings, and those fleeing through humanitarian corridors. I'm joined today by 4 experts in military issues, national security, war crimes prosecutions, and peace negotiations. And in this segment of our show, I'd like to focus the group's attention on what is being done to hold Russian leaders accountable for the brutal war crimes we are seeing in the news broadcasts. Let me return to Sandy Hodgkinson. You served as deputy to the ambassador at large for war crimes issues at the State Department. Can you start by telling us what is a war crime and which of the things we're seeing in the videos from the Ukraine meet that test?
A war crime is a crime committed during a time of war and is generally designed, war crimes prevention is designed at a very high level to minimize civilian casualties and ensure that the military targets military objects and personnel only during conflict. Specific categories of war crimes include targeting of civilians or their infrastructure, bans on certain types of weapons, and the crime of aggression, which we'll discuss separately. The specific examples of war crimes we've seen in images and reports from the Ukraine include the targeting of maternity and children wards in Mariupol, reports of Russians targeting Ukrainian citizens who are fleeing the country, and there have also been reports of cluster bombs in Kharkiv, which are bombs that break into separate bomblets and hit civilian areas. These are just a few of the examples that have been looked at as potential war crimes.
You know, the amazing thing is how so many people throughout the Ukraine have cell phones with videos and are documenting all of this, uploading it, sending it to the news, and we're seeing it play out in real time. Well, Professor Milena Stereo, let me ask you, what other international crimes are being committed in the Ukraine? We've heard from Sandy about war crimes, and she mentioned the crime of aggression.
In addition to war crimes that Sandy just mentioned and the crime of aggression, which I think we'll talk about in just a few minutes, the other potential crimes that are being committed in Ukraine involve crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are crimes that are committed against civilians on a widespread and systematic scale. And so to the extent that we're seeing the purposeful attacks and shelling of civilians and civilian objectives, we might see that Russian forces, in addition to committing war crimes, are also committing crimes against humanity. And let me just mention that the International Criminal Court, in a preliminary examination over the situation in Ukraine, has already concluded that there was reasonable basis to believe that both war crimes and crimes against humanity had been committed prior to this invasion. In other words, crimes that were committed in relation to the Crimea and Donbass regions by Russian forces and other paramilitary troops.
Do you think, Milena, that this could eventually be deemed genocide?
Well, the problem with the crime of genocide is that the crime of genocide carries with it this specific intent to destroy a specific group. And so if you could establish that the Russians are intentionally trying to destroy the Ukrainian national groups, then you could talk about the crime of genocide.
You know, so perhaps by trying to expel enough of them out of the Ukraine and replace them by people from Russia, that might trigger that kind of crime.
Exactly. The crime of genocide can be committed. It doesn't have to be murder. It could also be a forceful transfer of a population from an area into another area.
So, Paul Williams, let me ask you the big question. Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
Yes.
And who else in the Russian government or military should be in the dock?
Yeah, so Michael, I think it's clear that Vladimir Putin and the top generals and his security cabinet have ordered that these acts take place. Everything that Milena and Sandy have indicated is intentional. It's not an accident. It's not a rogue missile. It's not a rogue commander or some paramilitary. This is their war plan. You know, Sandy laid out the war plan that the Russians have in Ukraine. And it includes intentional targeting of civilians. That's a war crime. He's liable under the theory of joint criminal enterprise. And this gets to your question of who else. You know, it's Vladimir Putin, as well as his senior commanders, all the way down to the trigger pullers. We have not seen this level of intentional war crimes in many, many, many years.
And Milena, you mentioned that the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague has opened an investigation into Russian war crimes in the Ukraine, starting with the invasion of Crimea in 2014, but looking at the current crimes as well. Now, Milena, you just returned from the ICC. Can you tell us about the ICC process? How long is it going to take for this to unfold?
In the present situation, the ICC prosecutor has already announced that the ICC has jurisdiction over the situation, and the court actually has jurisdiction because Ukraine has launched this special declaration accepting the court's jurisdiction. In this type of a situation, the court can proceed in two ways. Either if the prosecutor opens an investigation on his or her own, or if there is a referral by one of the many state parties to the court. In this instance, more than 40 countries have already referred the situation to the court. So what that means is that the prosecutor actually can proceed right now today with the investigation. So in theory, the court has jurisdiction, but there are many practical problems with it, which might slow down the actual indictments, which is that the court, in order to conduct the investigation, would have to presumably travel to Ukraine or at least have access to the witnesses and the victims somewhere else. And so that will actually take some time between now and the time that the court is in a position to actually issue indictments.
And I'm wondering what kind of effect that might have on Putin. Paul, let me ask you this. If Putin is charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, even attempted genocide, how likely is it that he would actually be tried by the International Criminal Court?
Yeah, so Michael, there's actually a two-part question. One is, does it matter? And the reality is, yeah, it matters. If someone is charged with these war crimes, these atrocity crimes, it provides moral clarity. We're going to be in this for the long haul, the need to maintain sanctions, the need to do a number of other activities to push back on this aggression. Having an indictment makes it clear what's going on in Ukraine, as if we need more evidence, but it makes it crystal clear. And the second is never underestimate the long arm of the law. You could ask that exact same question about Milosevic from Serbia. He was eventually tried. Charles Taylor, president of Liberia, he was eventually tried. President Bashir of Sudan, he's in jail now in Sudan waiting extradition to the ICC. Not tomorrow. There's always a possibility that the long arm of the law is going to reach out, grab you by the collar, and bring you up to The Hague.
Yeah, you always say, Paul, that international criminal law is patient and persistent, and that might be something that someone like Putin should take into account. Now, Sandy, you mentioned the crime of aggression earlier. How is that defined, and would you say that Putin has committed that crime?
So the crime of aggression is defined as the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state. Clearly, Putin has committed the crime of aggression by carrying out military attacks against and within the independent nation of Ukraine. The only legitimate grounds for the use of force at all today include a Security Council resolution or self-defense, neither of which are present in this case. So this is an act of aggression. The ICC, though, cannot prosecute the crime of aggression in this case. At the time of the original Rome Statute establishing the ICC in 1998 and since then, nations have struggled over finding an agreeable definition for the crime of aggression. The statute also does not allow non-ICC states like Russia to be indicted for aggression unless the UN Security Council makes a referral. With Russia as a permanent member of the Security Council, they would certainly veto it.
And I'll just point out that, ironically, that provision was at the insistence of the United States more than by Russia. Now, that doesn't end the story, though. Milena, there have been calls to create a hybrid tribunal through an agreement between the UN General Assembly and Ukraine that would be able to prosecute Putin and other Russian leaders for the crime of aggression. Would this be a good idea? And how would this type of tribunal be different from the International Criminal Court?
So the short answer is yes, I do think that this is a good idea, and there's actually precedent for the creation of these type of hybrid tribunals through agreements between the United Nations and the host country. One example that I could name is the Special Court of Sierra Leone, which was established some 20 years ago through an agreement between the UN and the government of Sierra Leone. So there's definitely precedent for this, and the reason that this is a good idea is that, as Sandy just mentioned, the International Criminal Court in this instance cannot prosecute the crime of aggression because the crime of aggression aggression within the ICC has this very limited jurisdictional regime where essentially both the aggressor state and the victim state have to be members of the court. So the only way that Russian leaders can be prosecuted for the crime of aggression, which is really important, would be through the creation of another tribunal that could be complementary to the ICC, which would be prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity.
And I suppose that the political stars might be lining up for that because recently there was a General Assembly resolution condemning Russia that passed by a much larger margin than anybody had anticipated. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. So for our listeners, what's important to remember is that while in the Security Council, countries like Russia and the United States have veto power, votes in the General Assembly resolutions pass by a simple majority. So recently in the General Assembly, overwhelming majority of UN member countries voted to condemn the Russian invasion, and along the same lines, the same or similar majority of countries could vote to recommend the creation of a hybrid tribunal that would prosecute the crime of aggression.
And if that doesn't work, Paul, let me ask you this. There have been some suggestions that NATO itself could create an international court to prosecute the crime of aggression. What are the pros and cons of that approach?
Well, Michael, I think that would be clearly outside the mandate of NATO. We have an international criminal court. As Milena just laid out, there's precedent and a pathway for creating a hybrid tribunal. That's where justice lies. NATO needs to prepare to defend its member countries against further aggression by Russia, and it should stay myopically focused on that.
Let me ask all the panelists this question. So Russia has been going around making the "what about when the United States invaded fill in the blank" argument. It has referred to Vietnam in the 1960s, Panama in the 1979, Afghanistan in 2001, and Iraq in 2003. So I'll start with Milena. Is this a valid defense? How are those situations different from what Russia has done in the Ukraine?
So first of all, it's not a valid defense to point that another country might have also violated international law, hence I get to do it. That is never a valid argument in international law. And then I would also mention that the situations you mentioned are different from the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, although they might involve, or actually many of them do involve, violations of international law by the United States. All these other situations you mentioned involve the use of force by the United States against another sovereign country, either for national security reasons or under humanitarian grounds. The United States was not using force to expand its own territory or to essentially get rid of another ethnicity. So I would argue that these situations are vastly different from what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now.
But when Russia went into Crimea, they claimed that exact argument. They said, we're doing this as a humanitarian intervention. How is that a inadequate defense?
Well, it's an inadequate defense. And by the way, I do have to say that Russia has been very skilled at using international law arguments, but the problem with the Russian arguments is that they're not based on a factual reality. It is not accurate that Ukrainians are Russian. It is not accurate that Ukrainians are not a separate ethnicity. It is not accurate that the people of Crimea somehow wanted Russia to come in and invade. And so they're using these international law arguments, but they're twisting the facts to fit their own narratives.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, Michael, this is Paul. I would just add that this, as Milena says, this is law absent the facts. It's hollow, but it's an attempt by Russia to create a moral equivalence. And what is positively stunning is that in the past, this worked. It worked with Crimea. It's not working today. For whatever reason, the international community sees through these failed efforts of Putin and Russia to create a moral equivalence between what they're doing and what has happened in other places around the globe.
And we've been talking about international prosecutions, but there's also something known as universal jurisdiction, where any state can prosecute certain international crimes. For example, we're reading headlines about how Germany has been prosecuting high-level perpetrators from Syria who happen to end up in German territory. Now, Avi Cover, is prosecuting in a neighboring country's domestic court a viable option for this situation?
It certainly could be. What Germany is doing is what every state is really obligated to do under the Geneva Conventions, where states are obligated, required to search for war crime offenders and prosecute them. The question of universal jurisdiction, of course, does make things a little bit murkier. We talked about the crime of aggression. Not many states, for example, provide for universal jurisdiction over aggression, but many do over war crimes, but not necessarily with universal jurisdiction. So, for example, the United States is an interesting example. They have a Federal War Crimes Act, but it does not provide universal jurisdiction. It only applies to U.S. nationals. But theoretically, yes, a state could do so, but it might matter whom they are trying to prosecute. We've been focusing on Vladimir Putin as a war criminal. Domestically, states are going to come up against issues of immunity for heads of state. And so that raises a whole question, I suppose, of the end game for Vladimir Putin. He would not enjoy such immunity were he no longer the head of Russia.
Well, Avi, as a follow-up, when the United Kingdom considered a request for the extradition of Pinochet, the former leader of Chile, and he said, you can't extradite me to Spain for prosecution because I have head of state immunity, the UK said, no, you don't, because you committed the crime of torture. Would that kind of exception apply to the crimes that we're talking about today for Russia?
They could potentially, but again, there's two separate issues. There's both the functional immunity and the status immunity, and so the question, I guess, it would all depend on whether Putin was then a former head of state. I think we would be able to overcome those assertions of immunity were Putin no longer in power.
And then back to Milena, if he's prosecuted in an international criminal court, does head of state immunity apply there?
Michael, the short answer is that in an international tribunal, the head of state immunity does not apply equally as in a domestic context. So even if Putin is a sitting current head of state, he could still be prosecuted at an international tribunal like the ICC or another special international tribunal set up to prosecute him.
As we come to the end of this segment, I want to ask a final question of Paul Williams, who published a book a few years ago called Peace with Justice. Now, Paul, do you think it would be harder to negotiate a peace agreement with Putin if he's been charged with international crimes?
It'll be more difficult to negotiate a peace agreement, but it's the only way you're going to get a durable peace agreement. Russia needs to move past Putin. Indicting him for war crimes not only is the right thing to do, it's also a good matter of policy.
Well, that's a good place for us to take another short break. When we return, our experts are going to be discussing the way forward in resolving the Ukraine crisis. So join us in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts on the crisis in Ukraine. In the final segment, we'll be discussing the way forward. Let me begin with Avi Cover. In addition to the criminal case against Putin and other Russian military and civilian leaders that we've been talking about in the last segment, Ukraine has initiated legal actions against Russia in both the European Court of Human Rights and the International Court of Justice. You've been following these proceedings, Afi. Can you tell us where these cases stand and what sort of relief can be obtained in those venues?
Sure. So these are largely civil proceedings where, in both instances, Ukraine has sought provisional measures requiring Russia to essentially lay down its arms and refrain from military attacks against civilians, civilian objects, all of the variety of horrific events we've been talking about. In early March, the European Court of Human Rights decided to indicate to Russia to so refrain and to indicate those provisional measures. One challenge, of course, does attach here, which is that there's not a clear enforcement mechanism. But in the same vein that Paul raised earlier, the importance of this sort of ruling and proceedings will continue, of creating the legal record and making a statement by such a body as the European Court of Human Rights is incredibly important. I should note, in addition to the European Court of Human Rights, the Council of Europe in early March also suspended Russia's right to representation. That actually pushed Russia to just in the second week, shortly thereafter, pushed Russia to withdraw entirely from the Council, and that's really the lawmaking body of Europe. Finally, with respect to the International Court of Justice, it's a kind of clever way that Ukraine has brought this proceeding. Russia has, of course, claimed that the basis for its invasion of Ukraine is the prevention and punishment of claimed genocides in Luhansk and Donetsk. Ukraine, under the dispute resolution mechanism seeking to address this, whether in fact there is a genocide, has brought a claim against Russia. A hearing was held on March 7th. Russia chose not to participate. And Ukraine has asked the court to adhere to issue provisional measures requiring that Russia suspend all military operations. Again, not necessarily clear what is the enforcement mechanism for this, but again, depending on the ruling by the ICJ, by the International Court of Justice, it sends an important message of justice with respect to these matters.
It's so interesting that so many of the international mechanisms created after World War II are being used or attempted to be used in this situation. But meanwhile, Russia is committing much of the damage through aerial bombing campaigns. So let me go back to Captain Sandy Hodgkinson. What would you say explains, at least thus far, the U.S. and Europe's resistance to instituting a no-fly zone?
Well, first off, what a no-fly zone is, it would be an area over the Ukraine where any aircraft, including Russian military aircraft, are not permitted to fly. This would stop them from being able to drop bombs and lead their aerial campaign. To enforce a no-fly zone, though, you need military forces who can effectively counter the threat, thereby shooting down aircraft that are violating the no-fly zone. It's unlikely that Russia would comply, so now you have to look at who can enforce the no-fly zone. We don't believe the Ukrainian Air Forces alone can do that, so you would have to have NATO forces potentially shooting down Russian aircraft. This would take it from being just a conflict involving right now Russia and the Ukraine to a conflict now involving NATO. This could lead to a broader military engagement in the theater, including a possible ground war in the Ukraine, potentially ultimately pitting the world's nuclear powers against one another. This seems to be why there's so much resistance at this time to putting a no-fly zone in place.
So let me ask Melina Stereo, are there other things that NATO could do, other roles that it could play in this conflict?
Sure, Michael. As Sandy laid out for us right now, it is really unlikely that NATO countries will become directly involved in this conflict, because that would really entail using force against Russia, which is a nuclear power. And that might mean that we would be in a global third World War III involving nuclear powers. So as of now, especially because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, it is unlikely that NATO countries will become directly involved. However, NATO countries can direct military assistance to the Ukrainian forces, thereby enabling Ukrainian forces to fight this war against Russia. And as of now, Ukrainian forces have actually shown tremendous courage and a tremendous ability to resist the Russian invasion.
In fact, some are predicting a military defeat for Russia as military aid bolsters the Ukrainian resistance. Back to Sandy, do you think the Ukraine government can last much longer? Will the Ukraine people continue to fight if their government falls? And how many troops would Russia need to deploy to combat a lengthy resistance like the U.S. faced in Afghanistan?
A military feat for Russia would be a great outcome here. The Ukrainian resistance has fought with such exceptional bravery and unity, and this has impressed the world. The Ukrainian government has also shown its resolve and its ability to rally its people, so I certainly hope they can last longer. I think the people have shown that they will continue to fight if their government does fall, at least as long as they possibly can. Russia has its own experience in protracted civil wars, particularly their experience in Afghanistan, just like the U.S. faced, where ultimately they were unable to control the country. They would probably be reticent to have another protracted war of that type in general, costing both blood and treasure. This would require a large number of ground troops. How many is hard to tell. But Putin feels extremely strongly about the Ukraine. So if he remains in power, the commitment could remain even if it seems irrational.
Now, Sandy, Putin has raised the awful specter of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Do you think there's really a chance of that? And if it happened, how would the West respond?
I like to believe that even Putin is not crazy enough to launch a nuclear attack. But many longtime followers speculate that at moments he's rational and moments he's not rational. The Western response would clearly depend on the level of the attack. A low-level tactical use of a nuclear weapon would not likely have the same outcome as a broader attack or one against civilians. Nuclear escalation in general would have a devastating effect on Europe and the world, so any response needs to be clearly war-gamed out for all of the prospects of success. So I think it's a sliding scale on how the West would respond. It really depends on the nature of the attack and the other circumstances surrounding it.
And I suppose he could accomplish the same thing by just blowing up one of the nuclear reactors. And just the other day, there was a report that there had been an attack that caused some of the buildings near one of the largest Ukrainian reactors to catch on fire. Do you think that that would be treated differently or similarly as if he used an actual tactical nuke?
I think that would be treated differently. I mean, I think just stemming from the original 1986 explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear factory, this has a symbolic importance to the Ukrainian people and the world. So taking any action against a nuclear facility would bring back horrors of decades that people experienced. And Russia's constant nuclear rattling in the background as a sign of strength adds to this concern. So I do think that would certainly be taken more seriously than the use of a low-level tactical nuke. But in any event, we should ensure the utmost adherence to the principle of no use of nuclear weapons, and we should really ensure that we take all measured steps when dealing with a nuclear-powered and armed state.
And this may be the scariest part of the whole situation. Now, Sandy, I know you have to leave our show a little early, so let me take this opportunity to thank you for joining us today. And meanwhile, I'm going to go to Paul. The sweeping sanctions that you were discussing earlier that have been imposed on Russia are having a very real effect on its economy. Paul, do you think the sanctions will drive Russia to the peace table?
Well, Michael, I think it's a two-phased process. And what's important to bear in mind is that Putin may be all in on Ukraine and he may have nothing to lose. Every other Russian has something to lose by these sanctions. Everything from the person on the street who's having difficulty buying bread and eggs to the oligarchs who basically are in business with Putin. The sanctions are not designed to influence Putin's behavior. They're designed to influence every single other Russian, and in particular the oligarchs who could promote a regime change, and then the sanctions would be driving them to the peace table. So I think in order to avoid the scenario that you were just discussing with Sandy, the international community needs to maintain firm adherence to these economic sanctions and really keep their eye on the need to use them for the regime change, which is the exit strategy, the off-ramp from this horrendous conflict.
And sanctions work best when they are being universally imposed. Let me ask Avi Cover, our national security law expert, are we seeing universal application of these sanctions, or are some countries resisting the call to impose them on Russia?
Yeah, we are seeing some resistance, most notably from China, India, and several of the Gulf states. And I think what it tells us is that our current world order is still disorderly. Russia is not as isolated as we might think here in the West, and as I think, quite frankly, as some of our media sometimes depicts, that Russia's actions aren't viewed with the same condemnation by all corners of the international community. Now, the connections to some of these countries might owe something to strategic, military, economically aligned interests, but also perhaps legal and philosophical alignment that views the West, that views the United States, that views Europe and NATO with a fair bit of skepticism, and sees some of Russia's grievances that we've discussed about Western imperialism, NATO encroachment, as quite legitimate. Additionally, I think the sanctions efficacy can be blunted when a country such as Russia can look to other nations for significant financial support. However, given the comprehensive nature of these, given the stronghold placed on bank transfers, the Russian central bank, I don't think relying on the Chinese yen rather than the U.S. dollar is a long-term solution for Russia. But still, it's something and may protract this conflict.
And the ruble is in free fall. The oligarchs don't have access to their millions. So a follow-up question for Avi, do you think there's a chance that armed individuals around Putin may turn on him and stop the war?
Well, I think Paul touched on some of this, and I think there's certainly, we can hope for it. But there's really honestly no way to tell. We have to keep in mind, Putin runs an authoritarian state. He's very attuned to his threats to power. He's encircled by people who say yes to his whims. But again, what I think we have to keep in mind is that what the people are seeing, certainly the public in Russia, isn't entirely what we are all seeing. This is state-controlled media, where mention of the war or invasion is now criminalized. And so people in Russia have a very different conception of this conflict. There are, to be sure, increasing protests on the ground, and so we may see matters turn. But polling finds a majority of Russians, reputable polls, supporting Russia's actions against Ukraine within Russia. Now, of course, the sanctions could continue to have such harsh effects that it does propel a military coup through the financial pain and desperation that these sanctions may cause. But I think it could also feed into Putin's narrative that the U.S. and Russia that the U.S. and the West are against Russia, and even rally people to the cause.
Now, China says it wants to be the mediator of this and resolve this dispute. And I think everybody's hoping that there is some off-ramp that Putin might take before things get really out of hand. So, Paul, you've served as counsel in a dozen peace negotiations, including several with Russia. If there was a peace negotiation to resolve the Ukraine crisis, what do you think Russia would be seeking?
So Russia is going to seek territory and legitimacy. It's going to seek the territorial corridor between the Crimea and the Donbass region, and it will also seek some territory in the northeast. It'll need to justify to the oligarchs, the people, the mothers of the fallen soldiers, that there was some territorial gain. It'll also be seeking legitimacy in terms of these narrative of no NATO expansion, the neutrality, and probably the disarmament of Ukraine. That's what the Russians will be putting on the table.
Okay, so as a follow-up, which of those are non-starters? And which of those do you see room to negotiate?
1, 2, and 3 are all non-starters. The difficulty is if Russia would have maintained its position of a threat, it may have negotiated some of the legitimacy questions, some of the neutrality questions. But after what Russia has done in Ukraine and the way in which Russia has done, 20 minutes ago, we're talking about war crimes, culpability for Putin and the commanding generals. It's going to be really difficult for any Ukrainian and, quite frankly, any international to appease or accommodate Russia, given the level of atrocity crimes that they've committed, because it would just embolden them to do more of it in Georgia, or maybe even in some NATO member states. They've crossed the Rubicon on this one. It's going to be really difficult to get a negotiated resolution with the current Russian regime.
And we can look at history to see how Russia would likely approach this. In 2014, the Minsk agreements between Russia, Ukraine, and the OSCE sought to end the war in the Donbass region of Ukraine. Paul, what did that experience tell us about a possible Ukrainian peace process?
The Minsk peace process was designed by the Russians to handicap Ukraine's political and economic development by basically turning it into a federal state and giving special powers and privileges to the Donbass region. Russia would go into a negotiation looking for a Bosnia type of handicapping of the regime or the democratic structure within Ukraine so that it could seek its objectives by basically moving Ukraine from its current status of democratic and relatively well economic developed into some type of dysfunctional state.
Avi, as we come to an end, let me ask you to tell us how you think this crisis is going to end.
Well, Michael, I'm not optimistic because I think at a minimum, as we've already seen, it's a terrible loss of lives. And I think we're even just seeing with day to day, things are only worsening. And so no matter the outcome, we are seeing horrific levels of bloodshed, and a member of the Security Council, permanent 5 countries, emboldened to act in such a fashion. The one hope, as you noted earlier, is we are certainly seeing significant participation in the international community and utilization of measures that were created to prevent atrocities like these.
Well, the world has just become a lot more precarious, and the consequences of the Russian invasion in Ukraine are likely to reverberate for years to come. It's time to bring the program to a close. Captain Sandy Hodgkinson, Dean Avi Cover, Dr. Paul Williams, and Professor Milena Stereo, thank you all for providing your insights about this extremely important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.